So, picture yourself in the heart of imperial China. Lanterns glow against palace walls, the scent of sandalwood drifts through the corridors, and whispers echo in 1,000 chambers of the forbidden city. To outsiders, this world looked like paradise, a place of silk gowns, gold ornaments, and unrivaled beauty. But step closer, and you'll see the price of this glittering illusion. Behind the red walls, women were crippled in the name of beauty, men were mutilated to prove loyalty, and love itself was transformed into a deadly contest for power. This is the history that was never written on scrolls of triumph or carved into stone tablets. This is the hidden story of foot-binding eunuchs and concubine politics, where pain was disguised as devotion, and survival meant surrendering your body to forces larger than yourself. Foot-binding, beauty that broke bones. The practice of foot-binding began in the Song dynasty and lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It started as a courtly fashion, when dancers with tiny, delicate feet captivated emperors with their strange, swaying movements. Soon, the lotus foot became the ultimate mark of refinement, but what it took to achieve that ideal was horrifying. Girls as young as 4 or 5 were taken by their mothers or grandmothers and had their feet soaked in warm water, often with herbs or even animal blood to soften the skin. Then came the bandages. The 4 small toes were bent under the sole until they broke, pressed so tightly that they would never grow straight again. The arch was forced upward until the foot folded almost in half, creating that unnatural, tiny shape. The bandages had to be tightened daily, sometimes for years. The pain was constant. Nails grew into the flesh, causing infections. In winter, frostbite often set in, and when the dead flesh peeled away, the stench filled entire households. Yet parents pushed their daughters through it, because in their eyes, no man of high standing would marry a woman with natural feet. The tragedy is that many girls knew exactly what was happening to them. Some tried to loosen their wrappings at night, only to be beaten or punished. They were told over and over that without lotus feet, they would be worthless, destined for poverty or rejection. And when the feet were finally perfect, measuring just 3 or 4 inches, the woman's life was permanently altered. Walking was slow and painful. Many couldn't leave their homes without help. Yet for men, this helplessness became part of the erotic appeal. Some husbands even claimed that intimacy was enhanced by the smell of the decaying feet, a disturbing fetish that reveals just how warped the obsession had become. Foot-binding was never just about beauty, it was a cage. It limited women's independence, keeping them bound literally and socially to their husbands' households. Even centuries later, when reformers begged for the practice to end, families resisted, clinging to it as though without broken feet, their daughters' lives would collapse. Eunuchs' loyalty bought with flesh. While young girls were crippled to be seen as desirable, young boys faced an equally brutal fate for the sake of service. Eunuchs were men who had been castrated, usually as children, to serve in the emperor's palace. Without the possibility of fathering heirs, they were considered safe to guard the inner chambers where the emperor's wives and concubines lived. The process was nothing short of torture. A boy's entire genitalia were removed with a single cut, often with nothing more than a sharp blade and boiling water nearby to stop the bleeding. There was no anesthesia, no sterile instruments, and no guarantee of survival. Many died within hours. Those who survived were forever altered. Their voices often changed, their bodies developed differently, and their health was weakened for life. Yet families sometimes willingly offered their sons for this fate. Why? Because a eunuch who earned the emperor's trust could rise to immense power. Some eunuchs became gatekeepers to the throne, controlling petitions, silencing enemies, and deciding who was allowed into the emperor's presence. They could shape politics, influence wars, and amass fortunes, all while never being fully trusted, always mocked as less than men. Life inside the palace was a paradox. Eunuchs held the keys to secrets that could topple dynasties, but they were also the most humiliated class of men in society. Many lived lonely lives, rejected by both men and women. Some adopted children to carry on a name they technically could not pass down. Others turned bitter and used their positions to manipulate court politics in ways that made them feared as much as hated. It was said that a eunuch's loyalty was absolute, because he had sacrificed everything. But beneath that loyalty was always the shadow of resentment, and history is filled with tales of eunuchs who turned their pain into political vengeance. The Forbidden City and the Concubine's Cage. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace. It was a world of its own. Nearly 200 acres of red walls, golden roofs, and endless courtyards. But for the thousands of women who lived there, it was also a prison. Concubines were carefully selected, often from elite families, sometimes even sent as political gifts. On the surface, it seemed like fortune, to live in luxury, clothed in silk, adorned with jade. Yet the reality was far from paradise. Once a girl entered the palace, she rarely left again. Her entire life was consumed by a single mission: to catch the emperor's eye. The competition was ruthless. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women, all fighting for a fleeting glance or a single night of favor. If chosen, a concubine's status could rise dramatically. Even giving birth to a prince might secure her entire family's wealth and prestige. But failure meant fading into the shadows, forgotten, living out her life in lonely corridors where no one cared if she grew old, sick, or mad with jealousy. And the rules were suffocating. Concubines were guarded constantly by eunuchs, cut off from the outside world. They couldn't choose their lovers, couldn't speak freely, couldn't even grieve openly if their families died beyond the palace walls. Their beauty, their bodies, their futures, all belonged to the emperor. Punishments were harsh. A concubine accused of disloyalty could be whipped, starved, or worse. Rumors of poisonings swirled within the palace, rivals quietly eliminated before they grew too powerful. Even the empress, the official wife of the emperor, lived in fear of losing influence to a younger, prettier concubine. And yet, despite the suffering, many girls still dreamed of becoming one. Outside the palace, peasants toiled in fields, starving through harsh winters. Inside, at least, there was food, clothing, and the faint chance of rising to unimaginable power. It was a gamble, one that countless families were willing to make, even if it meant sacrificing their daughters to the gilded cage. Medicine, myths, and sexual superstitions. Within this world of concubines and emperors grew an entire culture of myths and beliefs about sexuality. Ancient Chinese texts blended medicine, philosophy, and ritual into strange, sometimes dangerous practices. One belief was that male vitality, his very life force, or ki, could be preserved by limiting ejaculation. Emperors, it was said, should sleep with many women but release as little as possible, absorbing the yin energy of their partners to strengthen their own yang. The result: dozens of young concubines, summoned night after night, often reduced to little more than living tonics for their master's imagined longevity. But this wasn't just palace gossip. Physicians encouraged these ideas, writing manuals that advised on timing, rhythm, and even specific positions, thought to balance energy. For the women involved, it was rarely about pleasure. Their role was to serve, to provide the emperor with supposed health and immortality, whether they wanted to or not. Diseases spread easily in these environments. Syphilis, known as the Guangdong sore, ravaged the empire in later centuries, particularly in urban centers. Without modern medicine, remedies ranged from swallowing mercury to applying strange herbal poultices, treatments that often killed faster than the disease itself, and superstition fueled cruelty. Some believed that intimacy with virgins could cure ailments, a belief that led to tragic exploitation of young girls, many taken from poor families with little power to resist. The blending of medicine and myth made sexuality less about human connection and more about fear. Fear of aging, fear of death, fear of losing power. The shadow of punishment. Sexuality in imperial China was tightly bound not only to ritual but also to law. Adultery was a crime, punishable by humiliation or execution. Concubines caught with other men, even eunuchs, were often killed, sometimes along with their lovers. For women, punishment could mean strangulation with silk cords, a method thought to preserve the body for burial, or forced suicide, where poison was placed before them and refusal was not an option. Even among commoners, control was strict, brothels flourished, but outside them, women faced harsh scrutiny. A wife accused of infidelity could be divorced, cast out, or beaten. Men, by contrast, often faced lighter consequences, their authority protected by custom and law. Inside the palace, the danger was doubled. Every action of a concubine could be read as betrayal. A misplaced smile, a whispered word with the wrong eunuch, even failing to show the correct level of devotion could bring accusations, and accusations in the Forbidden City were often as deadly as proof. For eunuchs too, the risk was constant. Despite their castration, some were accused of forbidden liaisons. In rare cases, eunuchs were executed simply for being too close to a powerful concubine. Loyalty meant little when court politics turned against you. The constant threat of punishment created a climate of fear. People whispered rather than spoke, watched their steps carefully, and bowed so deeply their foreheads bruised. Behind the glittering walls, life was less about luxury and more about survival. A survival bought with silence, submission, and sacrifice. Eunuchs powerless, yet powerful at first glance. The life of a eunuch seems like the ultimate humiliation. To serve in the palace, young boys were castrated, often sold by their families for money or favor. They lost not only their ability to have children, but also much of their physical strength, their voices often turning high and thin. Yet paradoxically, these men, or rather, these half-men, as some cruelly called them, rose to incredible positions of power. Why? Because eunuchs were trusted where other men were not. They could be allowed into the women's quarters without fear of scandal. They guarded concubines, managed daily routines, carried messages, and even helped prepare women for nights with the emperor. Over time, many eunuchs became confidants to emperors and empresses alike, wielding influence that far outweighed their official titles. Some eunuchs were feared more than generals. A few controlled entire networks of spies and informants, deciding who rose and who fell within the imperial court. Yet their lives were precarious. One wrong move, one accusation of disloyalty, and they could be executed without trial. And behind their masks of power lay suffering. The castration process was brutal, often done without proper medical care, leading to infections, deformities, and lifelong pain. Some eunuchs lived in shame, mocked by commoners, even as they strutted in silk robes through palace halls. Still, many sought the position. For a poor peasant boy, becoming a eunuch could mean escaping hunger, gaining wealth, and perhaps one day controlling the fate of ministers and generals. In a world where survival often meant compromise, they traded their bodies for power, and history remembers them as both tragic figures and ruthless manipulators, powerless in one sense, yet dangerously powerful in another. The brothels of the Middle Kingdom, outside the Forbidden City, another world of sexuality thrived. The brothels of China's great cities, from bustling Beijing to riverfront Nanjing, entire districts glowed with lanterns at night, filled with music, laughter, and the soft shuffling of silk shoes. But not all brothels were alike. At the top were the flower houses, where courtesans entertained scholars and wealthy merchants. These women were educated, skilled in poetry, calligraphy, and music. A night with them wasn't just about sex, it was about prestige. To quote a line from a Ming Dynasty diary, to drink with a courtesan is to taste both wine and wisdom. Further down were the common brothels, where poorer men sought quick pleasure. Here, women had little choice or freedom. Many were sold into service by desperate families, others tricked or kidnapped. Life expectancy was short, disease spread quickly, and beatings were common. Some women tried to escape, but the punishments were brutal. A captured runaway could be paraded through the streets, her shame made public. Brothels were also tightly bound to politics. Officials sometimes frequented them in disguise, arranging secret meetings or alliances. Corrupt magistrates taxed them heavily, pocketing silver while pretending to enforce morality. And despite periodic crackdowns, brothels always returned, too profitable, too ingrained in society to disappear. For the women inside, survival required wit as much as beauty. Some cultivated loyal patrons who protected them. Others schemed their way into becoming concubines of wealthy men, escaping the cycle of exploitation. But most lived and died in obscurity, their names forgotten, their stories erased. It was a world where pleasure and suffering lived side by side. One man's night of delight often meant another woman's lifetime of misery. Foot-binding. Beauty through pain. Perhaps no practice better reveals the extremes of beauty and cruelty in Chinese history than foot-binding. Beginning in childhood, girls' feet were tightly wrapped with cloth, their toes bent under, their arches forced upward, until the bones broke. The goal was the so-called lotus foot, tiny, delicate, and utterly deformed. To walk on bound feet was agony. The girl stumbled, swayed, and often developed infections as toenails cut into flesh. Yet this suffering was considered a mark of elegance. A woman with lotus feet was seen as more desirable, more marriageable, and more refined. In brothels, bound feet became objects of fetish. Patrons paid extra for a glimpse or even to touch them, though the feet themselves were often rotting beneath layers of cloth. The pain that crippled women became, perversely, a source of erotic fascination. Foot-binding was also a tool of control. A woman whose feet were bound could not easily run away, could not labor in the fields, and thus was kept dependent on men. It tied her body quite literally to the household, the husband, or the brothel where she was confined. And yet, despite the cruelty, many women took pride in their bound feet, boasting of the tiny shoes they could fit into. To refuse binding was to risk being shunned, to be seen as ugly and unworthy. Families often forced it upon daughters, not out of malice, but from fear they would never marry without it. The practice endured for centuries, binding generation after generation in silence and suffering. It was a reminder that beauty, in many societies, has often been built on pain, and that cultural ideals, once established, can enslave entire populations for centuries. Concubine politics, beauty as a weapon. Inside the Forbidden City, concubines lived in a glittering prison. At first, the role of imperial concubine might have seemed like a dream. Silks, jewels, servants at one's beck and call. But beneath the luxury lay a brutal competition for survival. The emperor had dozens, sometimes even hundreds of concubines. To be noticed was to rise. To be ignored was to wither away in loneliness. Each woman fought not only for the emperor's attention but also for influence, for the chance to bear a son who might one day become heir. A single night could change a concubine's fate forever. Rivalries were fierce. Stories survive of women slipping poisons into rivals' food, spreading rumors of illness, or bribing eunuchs to ensure their names were whispered to the emperor. Some concubines wielded subtle weapons, charm, intelligence, or carefully crafted displays of fragility. Others relied on raw beauty, adorning themselves with perfumes and ornate hairstyles meant to catch the emperor's wandering eye. But the dangers were immense. A concubine accused of plotting against another, or worse, against the emperor, could be cast aside or executed. Some were forced into suicide when favor shifted. Others spent decades locked in forgotten palace rooms, their youth wasted in isolation. And yet, some women mastered the deadly game. The most powerful concubines could control not just the emperor but also the empire. Empress Dowager Cixi, for instance, began as a low-ranking concubine, and rose to become one of the most powerful rulers in Chinese history, effectively controlling the Qing dynasty for decades. Her story proved that in the suffocating world of concubine politics, beauty and cunning could become weapons as sharp as any sword, but only for those ruthless enough to use them. Disease and medicine in the pleasure houses. Life inside brothels carried constant risks, but none more terrifying than disease. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections ravaged women and men alike. Without antibiotics or modern medicine, the treatments were often as horrifying as the illnesses themselves. Herbal remedies were the first line of defense. Physicians prescribed mixtures of mercury, lead, and exotic plants, believing these could purge evil humors from the body. Mercury ointments, in particular, were widely used, but instead of curing patients, they poisoned them, leading to tremors, madness, and slow death. For prostitutes, disease was almost inevitable. Many contracted infections in their teens, carrying them until death. Some women were deliberately examined before wealthy clients by hired physicians, but these inspections were crude and humiliating, offering little real protection. The stigma was just as brutal as the illness. Women who showed signs of disease were often discarded, thrown out of brothels to beg on the streets. A few managed to reinvent themselves as fortune-tellers or street performers, but most sank into poverty, their bodies ruined long before their time. Among men, venereal disease carried a different shame. Scholars and officials who contracted it might try to hide their affliction, using layers of perfumes and powders. Some even wrote confessions in secret diaries, lamenting the price of their indulgences. In this way, disease was more than a physical affliction. It was a reminder of the human cost of pleasure. For every wealthy patron laughing under lantern light, there were dozens of women slowly wasting away, paying the ultimate price for survival in a world that gave them little choice. Rituals of seduction and control. In both brothels and the palace, sex was rarely just sex. It was bound up with ritual, symbolism, and a hierarchy of control. Ancient Chinese manuals of intimacy, some inspired by Taoist traditions, claimed that the act of sex could channel cosmic energy, balancing yin and yang, extending life, even granting spiritual power. These beliefs filtered into both elite and common practice. Brothels sometimes advertised women skilled in bed arts, promising not only pleasure but also health and longevity. Patrons were told that sleeping with certain women, especially young virgins, could renew their vitality, a belief that tragically led to the exploitation of countless children. Inside the palace, rituals were even more elaborate. Eunuchs sometimes oversaw the emperor's intimate encounters, recording which concubines he visited and at what hour, ensuring no scandal or rumor could later arise. The emperor's sexual life was treated almost like state business, because the birth of heirs determined the future of the dynasty. But for the women, these rituals often stripped away any sense of intimacy or choice. Sex became a duty, a performance, an offering to the emperor or the patron. Even in brothels, where women might fake laughter and feigned affection, the underlying truth was clear. Survival required submission, and those who resisted rarely lasted long. Yet in these rituals we also glimpsed the strange blending of desire and superstition. Sex was not merely carnal but mystical, seen as a force that could shape health, politics, even the heavens. In this way, pleasure was never private. It was entangled with the fate of families, kingdoms, and empires. The fall and aftermath. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, winds of change swept across China. Reformers and revolutionaries began denouncing practices like foot-binding, concubinage, and the exploitation of prostitutes as symbols of backwardness. Western missionaries, too, campaigned against these customs, though often with condescending and moralizing tones. Brothels still flourished, but whispers of abolition grew louder. Concubine politics weakened as emperors lost power and the old imperial order collapsed. Eunuchs, once feared and respected, found themselves obsolete, dismissed from the palace with nowhere to go. Many ended their days in poverty, their influence erased in a matter of years. The women who had suffered under these systems rarely had their stories told. Few left writings or records, most vanished into silence, but the legacy of their struggles lived on in cultural memory. Foot-binding, for instance, left physical scars on millions of women well into the 20th century, long after the practice was banned. And in a way, these practices never entirely disappeared. The exploitation of women, the use of sexuality as currency, and the intertwining of pleasure with politics have reappeared in countless forms across history. What changed were only the costumes and the settings. The world of ancient Chinese sexual customs reminds us of a truth both uncomfortable and enduring. Human desire has always been shadowed by human cruelty. Behind every gilded palace wall or glowing lantern-lit brothel, someone paid a price, often in pain, humiliation, or silence. Eunuchs, the men who gave up everything for power. Among the strangest and most disturbing figures in Chinese history were the eunuchs. These were men who had undergone castration, often as children, either sold by desperate families or chosen because they sought a future inside the forbidden city. For most peasants, life offered little beyond toil in the fields, hunger, and poverty. But eunuchs had a chance, however slim, to live among emperors, concubines, and gold. Inside the palace, they became gatekeepers, messengers, confidants. They could walk where no other man was allowed, the women's quarters. But this access came at an unbearable price. Castration in ancient China was brutal. The entire organ was often removed, not just the testicles, using crude knives without anesthesia. Survivors lived with constant pain, infections, and shame. Families sometimes preserved the severed parts in jars of wine or salt, in the belief they could be reattached in the afterlife. And yet, for those who endured, the rewards could be immense. Eunuchs gained the trust of emperors and concubines alike. They became political players, whispering in the dark corridors of the palace, shaping decisions, and sometimes even controlling the throne itself. But power made them targets. Scholar officials despised them, accusing eunuchs of corruption and manipulation. Some eunuchs amassed vast fortunes, only to be executed in purges when emperors turned against them. Their lives were a gamble, from rags to riches, from nothing to everything, and back to nothing in the blink of an imperial decree. In the end, eunuchs embodied the cruel irony of palace life. They sacrificed manhood for influence, only to live constantly at the mercy of emperors who could erase them without hesitation. They were both indispensable and disposable, a reminder that power in ancient China always carried a terrible cost. The marketplace of pleasure, urban brothels, while the forbidden city had its gilded prisons of concubines. The cities of China teemed with brothels that served commoners, merchants, and scholars alike. These establishments ranged from filthy alleyway dens to lavish houses where courtesans performed poetry, music, and calligraphy for wealthy patrons. A night in a high-class brothel was not just about sex. It was theater. Patrons dined on banquets, drank endless cups of rice wine, and listened to songs performed by courtesans trained to flatter and charm. Some women became celebrities, renowned not just for their beauty, but also for their wit and artistry. To win the attention of a famous courtesan was a mark of prestige for any scholar or merchant. But beneath the elegance, exploitation lurked. Many of these women had been sold into the trade as children. Some were kidnapped, others were abandoned daughters whose families could no longer afford to feed them. Their beauty and skills were not their own. They were property, controlled by brothel keepers who profited from their every smile. Diseases spread easily, and women past their prime were often discarded with no safety net. The glamour of a courtesan's life was fleeting, and for every celebrated beauty, dozens more faded into obscurity, used and forgotten. Yet brothels were also hubs of culture. Many plays, poems, and songs were inspired by these women. Patrons wrote verses comparing them to moonlight or delicate blossoms, immortalizing their fleeting youth in literature. The irony was sharp. While society glorified them in art, it condemned them in life. The brothel then was both a stage of beauty and a trap of despair, a place where art, lust, and suffering intertwined under the lantern's glow. Secrets of foot-binding, beauty through pain. Perhaps no custom symbolizes the cruelty of beauty more than foot-binding. Beginning in childhood, girls' feet were tightly bound with cloth, the bones slowly broken and reshaped until they formed the infamous lotus foot, no more than 3 to 4 inches long. The process was excruciating. Toes were bent under the sole, arches crushed, toenails often rotting away in infections. Girls screamed in agony, sometimes fainting from the pain, but families insisted. Bound feet were the ticket to marriage with a wealthy husband. For prostitutes and concubines, bound feet became both a curse and a currency. Men fetishized them, believing they represented delicacy, submission, and erotic allure. Some even wrote erotic poems about the swaying gait of women forced to walk with broken, twisted feet. But the reality was grotesque. Women with bound feet could barely stand, much less work. Their lives were filled with constant pain and immobility. Many became dependent on servants or family members. And yet, in a society where survival often depended on pleasing men, the pain was endured generation after generation. Foot-binding was more than just a tradition, it was a weapon of control. It crippled women both physically and socially, ensuring they remained dependent, powerless, and confined to the roles chosen for them. Only in the early 20th century did reformers succeed in outlawing the practice. Though many women who had undergone it lived into modern times, carrying their broken feet as living relics of a vanished world. The lotus foot was admired as a symbol of beauty, but in truth it was the mark of generations of suffering, pain disguised as elegance, obedience enforced through mutilation. The emperor's bedroom. Rituals of power and desire. The emperor's bed was not a private space, but a stage upon which the future of the dynasty was played out. Each night, eunuchs presented ivory or silk plaques bearing the names of concubines. The chosen woman was stripped, wrapped in a quilt, and carried into the emperor's chambers. This ritual ensured fairness and record-keeping, but it stripped intimacy of all spontaneity. The emperor's encounters were treated like official duties. Overseen, documented, and sometimes even timed, eunuchs recorded which concubines spent the night, so no rumors of illegitimate heirs could later challenge succession. For the emperor, sex was power. To favor a woman was to elevate her clan, granting political influence to her family. To neglect another was to doom her to obscurity. For the women, every encounter carried monumental stakes. Bear a son, and you might rise to empress. Fail, and you might vanish into forgotten corridors. Yet even the emperor was not free. His sexual life was bound by superstition and rules. Taoist advisors warned him against overindulgence, claiming too much release would weaken his vital energy. Some texts even prescribed positions and techniques meant to ensure the emperor absorbed his partner's essence rather than losing his own. In this way, the emperor's most private acts became matters of cosmic importance, intertwined with politics, spirituality, and destiny. His bedchamber was less a place of love than a theater of duty, where pleasure, ritual, and power collided in a drama that shaped the empire itself. Concubine politics, the deadly games of survival. Inside the Forbidden City, the emperor's concubines lived in an environment that was as dangerous as it was luxurious. From the outside, it might seem like a life of privilege. Silk robes, perfumed chambers, and endless feasts. But behind the painted screens lay a battlefield every bit as ruthless as the wars fought beyond the palace walls. Concubines were ranked in a rigid hierarchy. At the top stood the empress, the official wife of the emperor, and beneath her a pyramid of favored consorts, lesser concubines, and palace women. But rank alone did not secure survival. A single night with the emperor could transform a forgotten concubine into one of the most powerful women in the empire. Equally, a single misstep could lead to disgrace, banishment, or even death. Jealousy was inevitable. Some women bribed eunuchs to whisper their names into the emperor's ear. Others resorted to sorcery, burning charms, mixing potions, or wearing amulets they believed would win his favor. But the most dangerous strategy was sabotage. There are accounts of concubines poisoning rivals' food, smearing rumors of witchcraft, or accusing others of disloyalty to the throne. One famous case occurred in the Tang dynasty, when consort Wu, later known as Wu Zetian, maneuvered her way from low-ranking concubine to Empress of China. She allegedly strangled her own infant daughter, then framed the reigning empress for the crime, leading to the empress's downfall. Wu's ruthless cunning eventually made her the only female emperor in Chinese history. But for every Wu Zetian who succeeded, hundreds of concubines lived and died in silence, their names erased, their faces forgotten, their stories lost to the shadows of history. To survive, a concubine needed charm, wit, and luck, but above all, she needed the emperor's attention. A prize as fleeting as a passing storm. Diseases of desire, the hidden cost of pleasure. While courtesans and concubines were celebrated in poetry and art, the realities of sexual health in ancient China were grim. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other venereal diseases spread through brothels and even palace harems, leaving behind a trail of suffering that few dared to discuss openly. Syphilis, in particular, was known as the Guangdong Soiree, after sailors and traders carried it into coastal cities. It spread rapidly among prostitutes and courtiers, disfiguring faces, rotting flesh, and causing madness in its advanced stages. In a society obsessed with appearances, such symptoms could destroy not only a woman's livelihood, but also her chance at survival. Doctors, bound by traditional Chinese medicine, attempted treatments that ranged from mercury ointments to herbal concoctions. Unfortunately, mercury often poisoned patients faster than the disease itself. Some women turned to Taoist healers who prescribed bizarre rituals, bathing in dragon's blood, swallowing powdered jade, or practicing bedchamber arts meant to realign sexual energy. The spread of disease also exposed the hypocrisy of social morality. Officials condemned prostitution publicly, yet many of them secretly indulged in brothels, carrying infections back to their wives and families. Eunuchs who lacked the ability to reproduce were often tasked with inspecting concubines' health, a humiliating process that reduced women to objects of medical scrutiny. For those afflicted, there was little hope. Prostitutes sickened and died young, their bodies buried without ceremony. Even in the palace, concubines who showed signs of illness risked being cast aside, stripped of titles, and sent to remote convents to live out their days in obscurity. Disease was the silent shadow haunting every embrace, every whispered promise, every night of pleasure. It revealed the truth beneath the painted lips and perfumed robes, that the pursuit of beauty and desire often ended in decay, suffering, and death. The fall of a courtesan. From glory to ruin. The life of a courtesan was a tightrope walk between admiration and ruin. At the height of her beauty, she could captivate scholars, generals, and merchants alike. Patrons wrote poetry comparing her to immortal fairies, showered her with silks, jewelry, and gold. Some even ransomed courtesans from their brothel keepers, installing them as mistresses in grand mansions. But fame came with danger. A courtesan who refused a powerful client risked punishment. One wrong word could see her accused of disrespect or betrayal, leading to beatings or exile. Some were forced into marriages they did not want, trapped in domestic cages after tasting the brief illusion of independence. Even for the most celebrated beauties, time was a merciless enemy. By their late 20s, many courtesans found themselves replaced by younger rivals. The makeup that once highlighted their charm could not conceal wrinkles and fatigue. Brothel keepers, ever practical, discarded them to cheaper houses or sent them to work as servants. One haunting story tells of Li Shangjun, a famous courtesan of the Ming dynasty, who resisted being sold to a corrupt official. Her defiance became legendary, immortalized in plays, but it cost her dearly. Her career ended in disgrace, and she died young, remembered in literature but destroyed in life. This cycle of glory and downfall was the unspoken truth of the brothel world. To outsiders, courtesans seemed like stars, dazzling and untouchable. But beneath the glamour lay fear. Fear of fading beauty, fear of poverty, fear of being forgotten. Their rise was swift, but their fall was inevitable, as relentless as the turning of the seasons. The price of obedience, women as tools of empire. In ancient China, sexuality was never just private, it was political. Women's bodies became instruments of diplomacy, loyalty, and power. Dynasties often exchanged princesses in political marriages, binding kingdoms together through alliances. For the women themselves, these marriages were chains disguised as silken veils. Take Princess Wensheng of the Tang dynasty, sent to Tibet in the 7th century as part of a peace treaty. She carried with her books, Buddhist relics, and artisans, transforming Tibetan culture. Yet her own life was one of exile, uprooted from her homeland, forced to live in a foreign court, her womb treated as a tool for producing heirs who would secure peace between empires. Even within China's borders, obedience was demanded. Filial piety dictated that daughters submit to fathers, wives submit to husbands, and concubines submit to emperors. A woman's chastity was prized above her life. Widows who resisted remarriage were celebrated as paragons of virtue, while those accused of infidelity faced brutal punishments. From public shaming to execution, what made this obedience more insidious was the way it was cloaked in beauty. Foot-binding was praised as elegance, concubinage as honor, prostitution as art, yet beneath the silken poetry lay suffering, control, and exploitation. Women's desires were rarely their own. They were bent, twisted, and reshaped to fit the empire's needs. In the end, whether as concubines in the palace, courtesans in the brothel, or princesses sent across mountains, women bore the weight of obedience. Their sacrifices fueled dynasties, inspired poetry, and upheld traditions, but left them voiceless, remembered not as individuals but as symbols and stories written by men. The eunuch's secret world. The forbidden city was not ruled by the emperor alone. Behind the vermilion walls and golden roofs lay another hidden world. The eunuchs castrated at a young age, often by poverty-stricken families desperate for survival. Eunuchs served as gatekeepers to the emperor's inner chambers. Their role in the sexual politics of the palace was paradoxical. On one hand, their mutilation ensured they posed no threat to the emperor's bloodline. On the other, their proximity to the women of the harem gave them a kind of invisible power few men could ever dream of. Eunuchs decided which concubines were summoned to the emperor's bed. They monitored pregnancies, handled whispers, and sometimes even falsified records to elevate certain women over others. Some eunuchs became infamous for corruption. They smuggled women into the palace, sold access to the emperor's favor, and lived in decadence while the empire suffered. Yet others were loyal servants, wielding influence not for themselves but for the emperor they served. But their existence was always tinged with tragedy. Stripped of manhood, eunuchs often suffered infections, lifelong pain, and deep psychological scars. Some turned to art, calligraphy, or religion to fill the void. Others drowned themselves in cruelty, abusing the very women they were supposed to protect. Their world was one of contradictions, powerless yet powerful, reviled yet indispensable, mutilated yet at the very center of China's imperial heart. Taoist bedchamber art, the illusion of immortality. Long before Western medicine arrived in China, Taoist monks and scholars preached the secrets of immortality. Through bedchamber arts, an elaborate set of sexual practices that blurred the line between spirituality and exploitation. According to Taoist philosophy, sexual energy, or jing, was the essence of life. Men were warned not to waste it recklessly, while women were believed to hold endless reserves of this precious force. This created a dangerous imbalance. Men were encouraged to draw energy from women during intercourse, supposedly to prolong life, improve health, and even achieve immortality. The result was often cruel. Powerful men used these teachings as an excuse to sleep with dozens, sometimes hundreds of young girls, believing their youth would replenish his strength. Manuals instructed men on how to avoid ejaculation, claiming it preserved vitality. Women were reduced to vessels, their own pleasure treated as irrelevant, their role confined to feeding the man's pursuit of longevity. While some Taoist texts emphasized mutual harmony and balance, in practice the philosophy often became a justification for exploitation. The emperor himself was sometimes told his health depended on bedding virgins, a practice that brought unimaginable suffering to countless women who had no say in the matter. In the end, the promise of immortality was an illusion. No man ever lived forever, but the pursuit of it left scars across generations of women who had been reduced to little more than instruments of another's desire. When beauty became a weapon, in imperial China, beauty was not just admired, it was weaponized. A woman's face could spark wars, topple dynasties, or save entire kingdoms. Take the story of Doji, the infamous consort of King Zhou of Shang, described as unimaginably beautiful. She was blamed for driving the king to madness and cruelty, leading to the fall of the Shang dynasty. Whether she truly orchestrated this destruction or was a scapegoat, her beauty was immortalized as a curse, a warning that a woman's allure could bring disaster. Or consider Wang Zhaozhong, a palace woman so beautiful that her mere presence changed history. when sent as a bride to the Zhongyu chieftain to secure peace. Her grace and charm softened hostilities between nomads and the Han dynasty. Her face became not just a personal trait but a political tool, wielded like a weapon across battle lines. But this weaponization of beauty was double-edged. Women who failed to please were discarded. Those who pleased too much were seen as dangerous. Beauty became both a blessing and a curse, a fragile shield that could collapse with age, jealousy, or a shift in power. In the halls of power, beauty was never truly a gift. It was a loaded weapon, and the women who carried it often paid the price. Death, silence, and erasure. Behind the grandeur of Chinese courts and brothels, countless women disappeared into silence. Their names were erased, their faces forgotten, their stories buried beneath centuries of dust. When a concubine fell from favor, she might be banished to a convent, her head shaved, her silks replaced with rough robes. Prostitutes who grew old or ill were discarded onto the streets, their once admired faces reduced to shadows begging for food. Even princesses, married off for political alliances, often lived out lives of quiet exile in foreign lands, their identities swallowed by duty. In death, most of these women left no legacy. Their graves went unmarked, their stories untold. Only a few, like Wu Zixin or Li Shongjun or Wang Zhaojun, survived in memory. Not because of who they were as individuals, but because their lives fit into stories that men wanted to tell. The silence is perhaps the most haunting legacy of all. For every tale of a famous courtesan or concubine, there are thousands of others lost forever. Women who laughed, cried, loved, and dreamed, yet whose existence was reduced to ashes in history's furnace. The hidden legacy of desire. Though the rituals and practices of ancient China were often cruel, exploitative, and disturbing, they left a profound legacy. They shaped not only Chinese society but the very fabric of its art, poetry, and culture. The erotic manuals, the tales of courtesans, the rise and fall of powerful concubines, all of these became woven into China's cultural memory. Paintings celebrated the delicate steps of bound feet, plays dramatized the intrigues of the harem, and poems immortalized fleeting moments of passion. But the legacy is doubly edged, for behind the beauty of these cultural artifacts lies the suffering of the women who inspired them. Their pain became entertainment, their lives became allegory, their bodies became symbols. Today, when we look back at these practices, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. But what was once considered elegance or tradition was often built upon cruelty and control. Yet in remembering, we give voice to those who were silenced. Their stories remind us that history is never just about emperors and dynasties. It is also about the forgotten lives hidden in the shadows. And so we reach the end of this journey into the hidden, haunting world of sexuality, power, and survival in ancient China. A world of bound feet, silken chambers, and whispered betrayals. A world where beauty could be both salvation and death sentence. A world where women's lives were twisted into symbols, their bodies shaped into tools of empire, their voices silenced, yet not entirely lost. If you found this story as unsettling and fascinating as I did, make sure to subscribe to Calm History. Here, we uncover the strangest, most forgotten corners of human history, not the polished tales from textbooks, but the raw, bizarre, and often disturbing realities of the past. Leave a comment with your thoughts. What shocked you most about these rituals? Which story stayed with you? And if you'd like more journeys like this one, share this video with a friend who loves strange history. History is never as distant as we think. The shadows of the past linger still.